You ever notice how some stories don't begin with love, but with shame? This one starts in a quiet suburban hospital. On a night that should have been filled with joy, a baby boy was born, tiny, fragile, but alive. His cries filled the room, but instead of smiles, the air grew heavy. Because this little boy was born with a disability. Instead of reaching out with comfort, his mother turned her face away. His father's shoulders stiffened. There was no sparkle in their eyes. No whispered promises of unconditional love. What should have been a celebration became the first moment of rejection. From the very beginning, the boy was treated like a secret, while other parents boasted about their children's first steps or school awards. His parents barely spoke his name. At family gatherings, they kept him inside. When neighbors stopped by, he was sent upstairs with a toy just to keep him out of sight. He grew up learning, and not that he was loved, but that he was a burden, and he felt it every single day. The silence at the dinner table when he tried to speak. The quick, embarrassed look in his father's eyes. Whenever someone asked about the kids. Even the way his mother sighed whenever she had to help him. Imagine being a child and realizing you're not the pride of your parents, you're their shame. He started asking questions, innocent at first. Why don't I go outside with my brothers? Why can't I sit at the table when we have guests? The answers never came with kindness. Only sharp words, or worse, silence. And silence to a child is louder than anything else. Then came the moment that changed everything. One afternoon, the boy overheard his parents whispering. They thought he was asleep, but he was listening from the hallway. His father's voice was low, bitter. We can't keep living like this. He'll never be normal. His mother didn't argue. Instead, she said something that cut deeper than any blade. He's not the son I prayed for. That night, he cried himself to sleep, clutching the thin blanket on his bed. He was only 8 years old, but he already knew what it meant to be unwanted. A few weeks later, it got worse. His parents dressed him up, told him they were taking him on a trip. He was excited. He thought maybe finally they were going to give him the attention he had begged for. But instead of a vacation, they drove him to a gray building on the edge of town. A place that smelled of disinfectant and loneliness. It was a children's home, and they left him there. He ran after them, shouting, "Please don't go. I'll be better, I promise." But his mother wouldn't turn around. His father shut the car door, started the engine, and drove away without a single glance back. The boy stood on the steps, tears streaming down his face, watching the taillights fade. In that moment, he wasn't just abandoned, he was erased. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a small voice whispered that this wasn't the end. That maybe, just maybe, the people who cast him aside had no idea what kind of fire they had lit inside him. Because while his parents saw a burden, the world was about to discover a fighter. The first night in the children's home felt like sleeping inside a question no one wanted to answer. The building was old, with hallways that swallowed footsteps and doors that didn't quite meet their frames, sighing after dark. The boy lay on a narrow mattress and stared at a ceiling mapped with hairline cracks, counting them like stars he couldn't name. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw taillights turning a corner and disappearing. Morning didn't bring comfort. It brought rules. Wake up bell, line up, breakfast, chore charts taped to the wall with curling edges. A staff member handed him a plastic tray and a spoon, both scratched and dulled from 1,000 mornings just like this one. Oatmeal, lukewarm, toast, tired. He sat at the end of a long table while voices ricocheted around the cafeteria, too loud, too fast. Kids learn how to size each other up without words. They looked at the careful way he moved, the little adjustments he made without thinking. One African-American boy with a shaved head and permanent squint dragged his tray to the seat across from him, chewing like it was a threat. "You knew?" The boy nodded. "What's wrong with you?" He pressed his lips together and kept his eyes on the oatmeal. A dozen answers fought for space in his throat. None of them made it out. Shaved head laughed. "Whatever. Don't touch my stuff. Boundaries drawn like tripwires. Don't sit there. Don't use that sink. Don't touch the remote." The boy learned quick. Power wasn't announced. It was enforced by who got the bigger slice of bread, who changed the TV channel, who expected you to apologize just for existing. Classes were held in a cramped basement room where the lights buzzed and the pencils were always dull. He worked hard. It wasn't about grades at first. It was about control. He couldn't control where he slept or the smell of bleach. But he could control the neatness of his notes, the way numbers lined up and obeyed. Math didn't care if you limped. Equations didn't roll their eyes. Every afternoon there was free time, which meant the brave played basketball on a cracked court and the careful disappeared. He learned the quiet places, the back stairwell with the cool metal railing, the laundry room when dryers hummed, and the tiny library. He'd run his fingers along the spines of donated paperbacks and wonder who had loved them before. The African-American staff weren't cruel. They were tired. You could hear it in the way they said his name, soft, distant, saving their voices. One woman, Mrs. Carter, had a halo of gray curls, a posture that said she'd seen storms. She kept peppermints in her pocket and passed them like secrets. She caught him in the library one evening with a stack of math worksheets he'd borrowed and finished for no one but himself. "You like numbers?" she asked. "They make sense," he said, more than he'd meant to reveal. "They do," she agreed. "Until they don't. That's when you ask better questions." He looked up. Adults usually told him what to do. She was the first to hand him a key and say, "Try the door yourself." Kindness is never the only weather. Small humiliations, a shoe misplaced, a clean sweater soaked, a nickname traveling faster than his real one. He learned to search quietly, to roll his socks tight, to keep his few precious items, an old photo, a spiral notebook, a pen tucked under his pillowcase. On Sundays, volunteers came with smiles and promises. Some meant it. Some needed to see themselves reflected in a good deed. The African-American boy nodded, careful and polite, like someone walking across thin ice. Every handshake felt like a test he hadn't studied for. Would they ask the wrong question? Would he give the wrong answer? At dinner one night, Shaved Head knocked a cup of juice into his lap and laughed too loud. The room watched, ready for the spectacle. The African-American boy stood, calm, folded the wet napkin in half, then in quarters, lining it up on the tray. He changed clothes. He refused the role assigned, the one who flinches. Dignity is a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. After lights out, whispered stories floated from bunk to bunk. Rumors of kids who ran away, kids who got lucky with backyards and swing sets, kids who turned 18 and vanished into a world that didn't care whether they could swim. The boy listened and made a quiet promise. If he ever left this place, he wouldn't drift. He would chart. He would move with intention, like a ship cutting a clean line through dark water. Weeks turned into months. He grew. Not taller, but inward, in ways that matter when no one is keeping score. He learned to breathe through pain. He learned the difference between silence that hides and silence that heals. He showed up early to the computer lab and stayed late in the library. He fixed a jam printer with a paperclip. He solved a logic puzzle the staff had turned into a challenge wall and left it there without signing his name. One afternoon, an African-American man visited the library. He wasn't a volunteer the African-American boy recognized, not from the usual groups. The African-American man studied outdated manuals, then watched the African-American boy work through algebra problems from a discarded workbook. When the boy looked up, the man smiled. Not pity, not performance, recognition. "You solved that system pretty fast," the man said. "Mind if I show you another way?" The boy hesitated, then slid the paper across the table. Sometimes the door you've been pushing opens inward. When you grow up in a place where everything feels temporary, temporary beds, temporary friends, temporary kindness, you learn not to expect permanence. So when the man in the library returned the next day, the boy noticed. When he came back the day after that, he started to wonder. And when the man asked his name and actually remembered it, the boy felt something he hadn't felt in years. Seen. The man introduced himself as Mr. Daniels. Not a staff member, not a volunteer passing through, but a retired teacher who spent his free time tutoring kids who wanted more than the bare minimum. He wasn't flashy. He wore the same gray jacket every time, carried a thermos of coffee that smelled burnt, and spoke in a voice that didn't rise or fall much. But when he leaned over a page, the whole world seemed to narrow to the problem at hand. "Let's try it this way," he'd say, sketching out an equation. "See how the numbers balance? They're not fighting each other. They're finding equilibrium." The boy absorbed every word like it was oxygen. He wasn't just solving math anymore. He was unlocking doors, building bridges, stacking stepping stones across a river too wide to swim. It wasn't just math. Mr. Daniels slid history books across the table. Biographies of inventors, leaders, thinkers who started with nothing but an idea and ended up changing everything. Read this one, he said. Notice how he failed over and over. That's the point. Failure isn't a stop sign, it's a detour. For the first time, the boy didn't feel like a mistake. He felt like a project under construction. But growth attracts attention, and not all of it good. Shaved head in a circle noticed the way the boy started carrying books with him, the way Mr. Daniels seemed to choose his table over anyone else's. One afternoon, they cornered him outside the laundry room. Think you're better than us now? Shaved head sneered, poking a finger into his chest. The boy clenched his fist but didn't swing. He'd learned a different kind of strength. He met the bully's eyes and said quietly, "No, I just think different." Then he walked past. The fact that he didn't flinch, didn't beg, didn't break, that was the real victory. Nights became easier. He stayed up late reading by flashlight, tracing words until they burned into his memory. He wrote in his notebook, ideas, questions, even little plans for businesses he imagined running someday. Lemonade stands that scaled into companies, tutoring services that grew into schools. At first, they were just sketches, but sketches can become blueprints. Mrs. Carter noticed too. She slipped him extra paper, a few pens, even a second-hand calculator one of the staff didn't need. "Use these," she whispered. "Don't waste what you've got inside." What he had inside was more than numbers. It was fire. Then came the contest. The home had a partnership with a local school district, and once a year they held an academic challenge, math, science, essays, trivia. Most kids treated it like a chore, a way to get out of chores. But to him, it was a proving ground. He studied harder than he ever had, filling page after page with formulas, dates, vocabulary lists. Mr. Daniels quizzed him until both of them were exhausted. The day of the contest, he walked into a gymnasium filled with kids who had parents in the stands, cheering, waving signs. He had no one, just himself, a pencil, and a stubborn promise not to waste the chance. Questions flew across the stage. He answered them one by one, heart pounding, palms sweating. By the final round, it was down to him and a boy from one of the best private schools in the county. The last question was brutal, something about probability, layered with fractions and percentages. The other boy froze. He didn't. He worked it out step by step, steady, unshaken. When he gave the answer, the judge smiled. Correct. Afterward, Mr. Daniels clapped him on the shoulder. "You've got something rare," he said. "Not just brains. Drive. That's the fuel. Don't ever let it run out." The boy carried those words like armor. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was planning. He began to picture a future where he wasn't hidden, silenced, or ashamed. A future where he wasn't defined by what he lacked, but by what he built. And deep down, he made a vow. One day he would return to the people who had left him behind. But when he did, he wouldn't come back broken. He would come back unrecognizable. The first spark had caught, and sparks, given enough time, can start wildfires. The contest win should have been a victory lap, but for him it was just another reminder. No matter how high he climbed inside that home, he was still carrying the weight of parents who had thrown him away. Kids around him celebrated with their families, went home to dinners and hugs. He went back to a dorm room where the light flickered overhead and the sheets still smelled faintly of disinfectant. He told himself it didn't matter. He told himself he was stronger without them. But late at night, when the halls were quiet, the ache came back. He remembered the way his mother's hand had slipped out of his that final day, the way his father couldn't even look at him. That memory replayed like a broken record, sharp enough to cut. And then, just when he thought they were gone for good, his parents returned. It happened on a gray afternoon when the staff called him into the office. He walked in expecting another lecture about chores or behavior. Instead, he saw them, his mother sitting stiff in a chair, his father standing with his arms crossed, face unreadable. The boy froze. His heart kicked like it was trying to run without him. He hadn't seen them in months, hadn't even heard from them. And now, suddenly, they were here. His mother smiled, but it was the kind of smile you wear for photographs, not for love. "We thought it was time to check in," she said. His father added nothing, just studied him like a project report he wasn't impressed with. They asked a few questions. Was he doing well in school? Did the staff treat him properly? His answers were short, careful. Inside, he wanted to scream. He wanted to ask why. Why they had left him. Why he wasn't enough. Why they thought their sudden appearance could erase the nights he cried into his pillow. But he said nothing, because deep down, he knew this wasn't about him. This was about them. The meeting ended quickly. No promises of visits, no mention of bringing him home. Just a cold handshake from his father, a perfunctory kiss on the cheek from his mother, and then they were gone again. That was the last time he ever saw them in the context of family. For weeks after, he wrestled with it. Maybe if he had been stronger, faster, more normal, things would be different. Maybe if he had begged harder, they would have stayed. But slowly, the truth hardened inside him. No child should have to earn love. If they couldn't see his worth, that was their blindness, not his failure. Still, abandonment has a way of shaping you. It burns scars into your trust. It whispers that no one stays forever. And he carried that whisper with him as he grew older. The children's home was never kind, but it became tolerable when he understood its purpose. It wasn't meant to give him comfort. It was meant to give him grit. Every insult, every shove in the hallway, every stolen book or torn page became training. He was learning how to stand alone. By his early teens, he'd stopped hoping for reconciliation. When the staff handed him his file, a thin manila folder stamped with his name, he realized something. This folder was all that tied him to the people who'd left him. It was thin, almost weightless. And that's how much space he decided they would take up in his life from then on. Almost none. One night, sitting in the library with that folder beside him, he made a silent vow. I'll never beg again. Not for love, not for approval. The next time they see me, it won't be as the boy they abandoned. It'll be as the man they regret losing. From that moment, the switch flipped. No more wondering if they'd come back. No more aching for what he could never have. His eyes turned forward, not backward. The children's home couldn't cage him forever. He started looking beyond its walls, scholarships, part-time jobs, ways out. He wasn't running away. He was plotting an exit, one so sharp and undeniable that no one would ever dare call him a burden again. The boy who had been hidden, cast aside, erased. He was gone. In his place was someone new, hungry, determined, carrying the kind of focus only pain can forge. And somewhere, without knowing it, his parents had already written themselves into the ending of a story they would one day regret, because the child they abandoned was quietly transforming into the very force that would shatter their pride. Adolescence hit him in a place that already felt raw. The children's home wasn't built for comfort. It was built for endurance. By the time he turned 13, the games of childhood bullying had hardened into something sharper. Older boys tested him, pushed him, waited for him to snap so they could laugh when he did. He learned to measure rooms when he entered them, where the exits were, who sat together, who held the invisible power. It was survival by calculation. He wasn't the biggest, not the fastest, but he had something they didn't: focus. Every insult was a spark. Every shove into a locker was another log on the fire. And when he lay awake at night, staring into the darkness, he would whisper to himself, I'll outlast all of you. School outside the home wasn't easier. Teachers glanced at the address on his records and treated him like a statistic. Other kids saw the way he walked, noticed his second-hand clothes, and drew their conclusions. Cripple, orphan, words thrown like stones in the hallway. He stopped flinching after a while, but not because they didn't hurt, because he refused to give them the satisfaction. Instead, he doubled down. Homework became more than an assignment. It became a weapon. While others slept through algebra, he tore through textbooks. While others complained about essays, he treated each one like a chance to sharpen a blade. Knowledge, he realized, was leverage, and leverage was power. The staff noticed. Mrs. Carter slipped him extra books, whispered encouragements. Mr. Daniel still showed up, week after week, teaching him how to see patterns where others saw chaos. The boy began to crave those moments, quiet, focused, full of purpose. They were oxygen in a suffocating world. But even with mentors, loneliness pressed heavy. Nights stretched long. He would sit by the window in the dormitory, chin resting on the chip sill, watching families walk down the street outside. A dad carrying his daughter on his shoulders. A mom holding her son's hand, laughing at something he said. The boy would press his forehead against the cold glass and wonder if they knew how lucky they were. Then he'd remind himself, stop looking back, build forward. That mantra carried him through the hardest nights. By 14, he was finding small victories. A part-time job stocking shelves at a corner store gave him his first paycheck. It wasn't much, But the weight of those crumpled bills in his pocket felt like proof. Proof he could earn, that he could stand, that he didn't need anyone's pity. The job also taught him discipline, showing up on time, working when he was tired, learning to read customers' faces, to predict needs before they asked. Skills most kids his age ignored, he treated like bricks in a foundation. Still, the home had its storms. One night, Shaved Head, older now, meaner, cornered him again, this time with two friends. They shoved him against a wall, taunting him for working at a loser job. The old him might have broken down, but he stood taller, eyes steady, and said, "At least I'm building something." It caught them off guard. They laughed, but it was nervous, unsettled. He walked away, dignity intact. That was when he realized strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet refusal to be reduced. Each season brought new tests, exams, chores, the constant churn of kids coming and going, adopted, moved, vanished. He stayed, he endured, and endurance, he discovered, is its own kind of armor. By 15, whispers started. Teachers, mentors, even a few staff members began to say things like, "He's got potential. He could go far." Those words weren't empty to him. They were fuel. But inside he carried a different conversation. One voice, sharp and familiar, always hissed, "You'll never be enough." His father's words, his mother's rejection. That voice never left. "The difference now," he answered back, "watch me." That defiance became his compass. It pointed him through every setback, every long night of studying, every shift at the store, every insult muttered under someone's breath. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was building muscle in his mind, brick by brick, preparing for a world that didn't know he was coming. And somewhere deep inside, he made a second vow, fiercer than the first. One day, not only would he escape this life, he would rise so high the same people who called him nothing would have to look up just to see him. The nights were still lonely, but now loneliness wasn't a void. It was a forge. By the time he turned 16, the boy had already built a reputation at the children's home. Not the loudest, not the strongest, but the one who kept showing up. Teachers whispered about his grades. Staff members nodded when he walked by, noticing how he helped younger kids with homework or carried groceries without being asked. But reputation didn't erase the truth. He was still a kid without a family, one step away from becoming another name on a long list of forgotten lives. That's when Mr. Daniels stepped in for real. He'd been around for years, offering tutoring sessions and encouragement, but now he pulled the boy aside after a study session. "Listen," he said, voice steady but serious. "You've got something rare. You don't just memorize, you understand. And you don't just understand, you apply. That's a skill people will pay for, but only if you know how to sharpen it." The boy frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Daniels continued, "you need more than books. You need opportunity. You need to see what the world looks like beyond these walls." Opportunity. The word hit him like a bell. No one at the home used words like that. Most talked about survival, discipline, maybe a trade job if you were lucky. Opportunity was a word for kids with parents who wrote checks and filled out college applications. Not for him. But Daniels didn't see it that way. Over the next year, he started introducing the boy to new things, not grand gestures, small openings, a summer program in the city where students built model businesses, a scholarship essay contest for underprivileged youth, even an old laptop donated from Daniel's attic, clunky but functional. "You're going to learn how to use this," he said, sliding it across the table. "Research, write, connect. It's your passport." The boy opened the laptop like it was a doorway. For the first time, the world felt wide. He stayed up late clicking through articles about technology, finance, invention. He read stories of people who had started with nothing, immigrants, orphans, misfits, and turned it into empires. Each story was a mirror reflecting what could be. But opportunity didn't erase obstacles. Other kids at the home mocked him for spending nights hunched over a glowing screen instead of playing cards or hanging out. "What's the point?" they sneered. "You think you're going to be rich or something?" He didn't answer. Not because he didn't have one, but because he knew they wouldn't understand. His vision had stretched beyond their walls. One Saturday, Daniels took him to a local university campus. They walked through tall brick buildings and manicured lawns, past students sprawled under trees with laptops and coffee cups. The boy's chest tightened, not with envy, but with hunger. This, Daniel said, could be you. If you keep pushing, if you don't let the world convince you to settle. The boy swallowed hard. He wanted it so badly it hurt. Not just the buildings or the books, but the chance to belong somewhere. Ambition wasn't a curse, but a currency. Still, doubts gnawed at him. What if I can't? What if I don't belong here? Daniel stopped, turned, and looked him straight in the eye. You've already lived through what would break most people. You belong anywhere you decide to stand. Those words carved deep. They stayed with him through the hardest weeks. The failed scholarship applications, the rejections that piled up like junk mail. Every no was a reminder of where he came from, but also a challenge. Prove them wrong. And he did. By the end of that year, he'd earned a small scholarship for a summer business camp. It wasn't much, but when he walked into that program surrounded by kids from wealthier families, he didn't shrink. He listened. He learned. He sketched ideas late into the night. His first project? A business plan for an after-school tutoring service, staffed by older students to help younger ones. The judges didn't crown him the winner, but they nodded with respect. They told him his plan was practical, scalable, smart. It wasn't victory, but it was validation. Back at the home, he pinned the certificate from the program above his bed. A piece of paper, sure, but to him it was proof. Proof that the world outside had taken notice, even just a little. And with that proof, the boy made his third vow. I will not be defined by where I started. I will only be defined by how far I go. The mentor had lit a match. The boy was determined to keep the fire burning. The certificate from that summer program hung over his bed like a North Star. Every night before lights out, he stared at it. It wasn't just paper. It was a reminder that he could do more than survive. He could create, so he tried. The first idea seemed simple enough, a tutoring service. He'd seen younger kids at the home struggle with homework. He thought, why not charge a small fee? $1 here, $2 there. I'll help, they'll learn. And maybe I'll save enough to buy better supplies. The staff gave him permission, half smiling at his seriousness. Some of the kids signed up, and for a few weeks it actually worked. He sat in the library after school, explaining fractions, sounding out words, showing kids how to structure an essay. They looked at him like he was a teacher, not just another resident. That feeling, that authority was addictive. But then came the backlash. Older kids mocked him. Mr. Genius thinks he's a businessman now. They made a game of disrupting his sessions, grabbing notebooks, heckling from the doorway. Eventually, the staff shut it down, not because it was wrong, but because it was causing conflict. That night, lying in bed, he clenched his fists under the blanket. His first attempt at building something had been dismantled. Not by failure, but by envy. Still, he told himself, lesson learned. Every idea has enemies. Next time, I'll be ready. He didn't quit. At his corner store job, he noticed customers complaining about prices, about not finding what they needed. So he started keeping notes. What people wanted, when they came in, what sold fastest. The owner laughed when he showed him. Kid, you should be running the place with all this detail. It was a joke, but it planted a seed. Businesses didn't just sell things. They listened. They adapted. That was a language he could speak. Armed with that insight, he tried again. This time, he pitched the store owner an idea. What if we make small flyers? Hand them out at the home, the church, the bus stop, discounts for regulars, maybe a loyalty card. The owner raised an eyebrow. You think people around here care about that? Try it, the boy said. Reluctantly, the owner let him print a batch. And sure enough, customers came back asking about the discount, waving the little cards he had helped design. Sales ticked up. The owner handed him a $10 bill as a bonus. It wasn't much, but it was his first taste of being paid for his brain, not just his hands. Failure had taught him something. Success taught him more. But with every step forward came another reminder of where he stood. At school, kids still whispered about his disability. They mocked his limp, mimicked his walk. Teachers praised his essays, but doubted his future. One even pulled him aside and said, "Don't set your sights too high. A stable job is good enough." Those words burned. Good enough. He refused to believe in good enough. So he turned the insult into fuel. He joined every contest he could find, science fairs, debate tournaments, even essay competitions. Sometimes he lost, sometimes he placed, but every entry sharpened his skills and thickened his skin. Every stage he stepped on, every certificate he added to his folder, was another brick in the wall he was building. One evening, after losing a debate round he thought he had nailed, he sat alone in the library, staring at the empty scoreboard. Daniels found him there. "You look like someone who just buried his best friend," Daniels said gently. "I worked hard," the boy muttered, "and I still lost." Daniels nodded. "And what did you learn?" The boy stayed quiet. "You learned what losing feels like," Daniels said. "Good, learn it now. Because the higher you climb, the harder the fall. If you can survive the small ones, you'll survive the big ones." The boy absorbed that like scripture. Losing wasn't the end, it was conditioning. By 17, he had transformed into someone no one recognized. Still living in the home, still carrying scars, but his eyes were sharper, his stride steadier. He wasn't just dreaming anymore. He was experimenting, failing, adapting, and trying again. Each setback left a mark. Each tiny win built a layer of confidence. He was no longer the boy who whispered into the dark, "Why me?" He was the young man who whispered, "Watch me." And soon the world would. By the time he turned 18, the children's home no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a waiting room. Every wall, every routine, every familiar face reminded him he was meant for something beyond it. He wasn't bitter anymore, not in the same way. He was restless. Legally, he was almost free. In a few months, the state would cut ties. Most kids dreaded that day. They called it aging out. It meant no more roof over your head, no more guaranteed meals, no staff to keep you from falling off the edge. For many, it was the start of a long downhill slide, but for him, it was different. It wasn't aging out, it was breaking out. He started preparing like a soldier before deployment. Nights spent filling out scholarship applications, sending essays into contests, researching colleges on the dented laptop a kind older black African man named Daniels had given him. Days spent working shifts at the corner store, stacking shelves with one hand and taking mental notes with the other. Money trickled in. Not much, but enough for a small savings account he checked every week like it was sacred. Still, doubt whispered. Where would he go? What if he failed? What if the world chewed him up, the way his parents had and spit him out? Daniels, a kind older black African man, countered that voice every time. Don't ask what if you fail. Ask what if you succeed. One Saturday afternoon, Daniels invited him to a downtown business networking event. The young black African man almost refused. He didn't have the clothes, didn't have the confidence. But Daniels, an older black African man, shoved a thrift store blazer into his hands and said, "Suit up. You don't need to blend in. You need to stand out." Walking into that conference hall was like stepping onto another planet. Men and women in crisp suits shook hands over deals he couldn't begin to understand. Tables were lined with brochures. Business cards changed hands like currency. He felt invisible at first, just a kid in a borrowed jacket. Then Daniels pushed him forward. "Tell them your story," he whispered. So he did. Not the tragic version, not the sob story, the vision, the drive. The small experiments he'd already tried, the lessons he'd learned from watching what people bought and why. Some people brushed him off, but a few listened. One woman, a local entrepreneur, handed him her card. "Call me when you're ready," she said. Ready. That word sank into his bones. He wasn't ready yet, but one day he would be. Back at the home, the days crawled. Kids teased him for playing dress-up with businessmen. Staff raised eyebrows at his late nights and big dreams, but he didn't care, because in his head, he was already gone. When his 18th birthday arrived, he didn't celebrate. He packed a duffel bag with 2 changes of clothes, a folder with every certificate, every recommendation letter, every scrap of proof that he was more than his beginnings, a notebook filled with plans, and a savings account balance that wouldn't impress anyone but meant the world to him. On his last night at the home, he sat by the window one final time, the same spot where he'd once pressed his forehead to the glass, watching families pass by. But this time, the ache in his chest was different. It wasn't longing anymore. It was hunger. He whispered the same words he had repeated for years. "Watch me." Then he closed the notebook, zipped the bag, and didn't look back. The next morning, he stepped out into the world with no safety net. No parents, no home, just grit, fire, and the certainty that freedom, even scary, uncertain freedom, was better than being invisible. And though he didn't know it yet, This first taste of independence was the beginning of a climb so steep and staggering that one day the world would have to tilt its head back to see him. Because freedom, once you get a taste of it, is impossible to surrender. Freedom came with no instructions. He left the children's home with a duffel bag, a thin savings account, and a fire in his chest. But fire alone doesn't pay rent. The first weeks were survival. He rented a room in a crumbling apartment building with paper-thin walls and a door that barely locked. He worked part-time jobs, stocking shelves, sweeping floors, bussing tables. It was enough to eat, barely. Nights were long and lonely, but he kept a notebook by his bed. That notebook was his compass. Inside were sketches of business ideas, half-formed plans, and questions he didn't yet know how to answer. He remembered what Daniels had taught him: observe the world, find the gaps. So he watched. One gap was obvious. In his neighborhood, small shops were scattered across blocks, each struggling alone. Most had no flyers, no strategy, no way to stand out. He thought back to the discount cards he'd created for the corner store. It had worked then. Why couldn't it work again? So he tried. He pitched himself as a marketing consultant, though he had no title, no degree, no office, just determination and a few sheets of paper. He walked door to door, explaining to shop owners how he could design simple loyalty programs, flyers, and advertisements. Some laughed in his face. "Kid, I can't even pay rent. You think I got money for flyers?" Others shrugged him off. But one owner, a tired man who ran a bakery, agreed to give him a chance. The boy spent nights designing a flyer on that old laptop. He borrowed a printer at the library, walked block after block handing them out. He even convinced a few friends from the children's home to drop them in mailboxes. For a few weeks, it looked like a win. Customers trickled into the bakery with flyers in hand, asking about the specials. The owner was pleased. The boy felt unstoppable. Then reality hit. The bakery closed 2 months later, not because the flyers failed, but because the owner had been drowning in debt long before. Suddenly, his success story was gone. Other shopkeepers shook their heads. See, marketing doesn't matter. What matters is surviving. Word spread. No one else wanted his help. The failure stung worse than the bullies, worse than the nights of hunger at the children's home. Because this time, it wasn't someone else tearing him down. It was life itself reminding him how fragile dreams could be. One night, sitting in his tiny room with bills scattered on the floor, he almost broke. He stared at the notebook where he'd written bold ideas, circled words like growth and innovation, and thought, what if they were right? What if I'm just chasing smoke? But then he remembered something Daniels had said back in the library years ago. If you can survive the small losses, you'll survive the big ones. This was a small loss, he told himself. Painful, humiliating, but small. So he got back up. He took more jobs, delivering newspapers, cleaning offices after hours. Exhaustion became his constant companion. But even then, he refused to quit learning. He read business books he borrowed from the library, scribbled notes about branding, customer behavior, economics. He studied people on the bus, in line at the store, listening to what they complained about, what they wanted. Failure hadn't killed the dream. It had sharpened it. Months later, he tried again. This time, he pitched himself to a local mechanic, offering to design a referral program, discounts for customers who brought in friends. It worked. Slowly, business grew. The mechanic paid him $50. It was more money than he'd ever earned for his mind. He walked home that night with the bill folded carefully in his pocket, heart pounding. Not because of the amount, but because of what it meant. He could build something from nothing. The road was long. He knew that now. There would be more failures, more losses, more nights alone with nothing but doubt. But for the first time, he also knew something else. He wasn't chasing smoke. He was learning how to make fire. Failure had taught him to be cautious, but it also taught him something else. No one builds an empire alone. For years, he had been the lone fighter, pushing through schoolwork, jobs, and schemes. But now, out in the real world, he began to see a truth he couldn't ignore. He needed someone, not a parent, not a savior. That someone appeared in the unlikeliest of places, a late-night diner on the edge of downtown. He was sitting in a booth with his notebook, sketching out numbers for yet another idea, a small delivery service for corner stores. You always do math over cold fries. He looked up. A young man about his age stood there, holding a coffee mug. His name was Marcus. Like him, Marcus had grown up with nothing. Foster homes, oddball, hustling just to stay afloat. The two traded stories, and for the first time, he felt that rare click of recognition. Marcus didn't pity him, didn't doubt him. Over the weeks that followed, the two became inseparable. Marcus had street smarts, the kind you couldn't find in books. Where the boy saw numbers, systems, and patterns, Marcus saw people, instincts, opportunities. They argued often, Marcus calling his plans too cautious, the boy insisting Marcus was reckless. But together the friction made sparks. One night, sitting on the diner's cracked vinyl seats, Marcus leaned forward and said, "We should do this for real. Start something." "For real?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "You've got the brains. I've got the hustle. Let's put them together." The idea scared him. Trust wasn't easy after a lifetime of betrayal. But something in Marcus's conviction broke through the walls he'd built. For the first time, he said yes. Their first venture was small, almost laughably so, a delivery service for local shops that couldn't afford big distributors. Marcus convinced shop owners one by one, while the boy built the structure. Routes, costs, records. They borrowed an old van that barely started, painted their initials on the side, and got to work. At first it was chaos. The van broke down more than it ran. Deliveries were late. Customers complained. But little by little they learned. They fixed the van with their own hands. They mapped faster routes. They charmed customers with consistency. And slowly the calls started coming in, first a trickle, then a steady stream. The boy felt it every time they finished a run and counted the crumpled bills. It wasn't just money. It was proof that two kids with nothing but grit could create value out of thin air. But partnership brought challenges too. Marcus was bold, sometimes too bold, promising clients things they couldn't deliver. They fought in the van more than once, voices raised, hands slamming the dashboard. Yet every fight ended the same way, with both of them back at work the next morning, pushing forward. Because deep down, they both knew this wasn't just a hustle, it was the beginning of a climb. One evening, after a long day of deliveries, they sat on the hood of the van watching the city lights flicker. Marcus smirked. "You know, one day we won't just be delivering other people's stuff. One day people will be delivering ours." The boy laughed, shaking his head. "That's a long way off." "Maybe," Marcus said, "but I believe it, and you should too." For the first time in his life, he didn't feel alone in his vision. He had someone who believed not just in the dream, but in him. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't easy, but it was a start. And sometimes the right start with the right person is worth more than any amount of money. Because this wasn't just about business anymore. It was about trust. And for a boy who had been abandoned, finding someone to stand beside him was its own kind of miracle. At first, their delivery service felt unstoppable. Every week, a new corner store signed up. The van rattled through the streets from sunrise to sunset, stuffed with boxes of bread, milk, cleaning supplies, whatever the shops couldn't fetch themselves. The money wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and for two young men who had grown up with nothing, steady felt like gold. But success has a way of attracting shadows. The first shadow came from the van itself. Old, stubborn, coughing smoke like a chain smoker. It broke down in the middle of rush hour one sweltering afternoon. Marcus kicked the tire until his boot nearly split. The boy sat on the curb, staring at the hood, steaming like a boiling pot. Customers were calling, asking about their deliveries. For the first time, he heard frustration in their voices instead of gratitude. They pooled every dollar they had to patch the van back together, eating instant noodles for weeks just to pay the mechanic. It hurt, but it worked, at least for a while. Then came the second shadow, competition. A larger delivery company noticed their growing client list and swooped in, offering faster service, lower rates, shinier trucks. One by one, customers left. Not because they didn't like the boys, but because survival leaves little room for loyalty. Marcus raged. "We started this. We built it from scratch. And now these clowns think they can just take it?" The boy was quieter, his anger running deeper. He had seen this pattern before. Hard work dismissed, efforts erased. It was the same shame his parents had burned into him years ago, echoing back in a new form. For days they fought. African black man Marcus wanted to slash prices, go head-to-head with the competition. The boy wanted to hold steady, find a smarter angle. Their arguments in the van grew sharp, words like knives. One night, Marcus stormed out, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. The boy sat alone at the wheel, head in his hands, wondering if this was the end. Not just of the business, but of the partnership. But then he remembered Daniel's voice. Every failure teaches you. Learn fast or get left behind. So he forced himself to think, what did they have that the big company didn't? Not trucks, not money, but relationships. They knew the shop owners by name. They'd carried boxes into the back rooms, shared coffee with tired cashiers, listened to complaints about bills and late rent. The big company had efficiency, but the boys had trust. The next day, he pitched the idea to Marcus. Instead of competing on price, they'd compete on loyalty, personal service, a guarantee that if something went wrong, they'd fix it themselves. Marcus was skeptical, but eventually agreed. It was slow, but it worked. A handful of shops came back, preferring 2 kids with a beat-up van who cared, over a faceless company that didn't. They didn't regain everything they'd lost, but they survived. And survival, he realized, was sometimes the biggest win of all. Still, the cracks remained. Money was tight, tempers short. Marcus wanted faster wins. The boy wanted stability. Their friendship stretched under the weight of it all. Some nights, the African, black young man lay awake in his rented room, staring at the ceiling, wondering if his first partnership was destined to collapse, like so many other things in his life. But deep inside, one truth kept him going. Failure hadn't killed him before. It wouldn't kill him now. This storm, like every storm before it, was just another test. And if there was one thing he knew how to do, it was endure the test. The boy who had once been abandoned was no stranger to loss. The man he was becoming refused to let loss define him. The business wasn't thriving, but neither was it dead, and sometimes that was enough to keep the fire burning. The delivery service limped along for months, like a boxer still standing after 12 brutal rounds. They weren't winning, not really, but they weren't on the mat either. And sometimes that was the most you could ask for. But then, almost by accident, the breakthrough arrived. It started with a single phone call from one of their loyal clients, a small grocery owner who was expanding into catering. "We got more orders than we can handle," the man said. "If you boys can figure out logistics, you can have the contract." Logistics, a word that sounded big, heavy, almost out of reach. But it was also a door. And the boy had spent his entire life learning how to push doors open that weren't meant for him. He threw himself into planning. He mapped out routes, calculated times, designed schedules with military precision. Marcus handled the relationships, talking to suppliers and smoothing over nerves. Together, they transformed the van into a workhorse, running deliveries morning to night. It wasn't perfect. They were exhausted, running on coffee and grit. But when the first month ended, they held in their hands something new. Profit. Real profit. Enough to pay bills, repair the van properly, and still have something left. For the boy, that money wasn't just currency. It was validation. Proof that the world would pay for his ideas, that his brain wasn't just a survival tool but an asset. He had once been told he was a burden. Now he was building value from nothing. With success came attention. A few more shops signed back on. A local restaurant asked for weekend deliveries. They printed business cards, cheap ones, black ink on thin paper. But when the boy handed one out, he felt like he was handing someone a piece of his identity. Marcus grinned one night as they counted cash at the diner where they'd first met. "See, I told you one day people would deliver for us." The boy laughed, shaking his head. "We're not there yet." "Not yet," Marcus agreed, "but we're on the road." Still, the breakthrough didn't erase the grind. They worked 7 days a week. The van still broke down at the worst possible moments. Rain-soaked boxes, tires blew on highways. They argued over money, over strategy, over who should have remembered to call which client. But beneath the frustration was something solid. They were building, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. One night, after finishing a particularly brutal set of deliveries, the boy walked home alone. The city lights reflected on wet pavement, and he thought about the path behind him, the rejection, the abandonment, the lonely years in the home. He thought about the notebook he used to clutch under his pillow, full of half-formed dreams, and for the first time he realized he wasn't just dreaming anymore. He was doing. That realization burned hotter than any paycheck. At the children's home, he'd once whispered, "Watch me into the dark." Now, for the first time, he believed the world might actually see him. It wasn't an empire yet, not even close, but it was a foundation. And he knew foundations mattered more than anything. Because once you lay the right foundation, you can build as high as the sky will let you. By the time he turned 20, people outside his block were starting to notice. It wasn't a headline yet, not a magazine cover, but whispers. Shopkeepers told each other, "Call those boys. They'll get it done." Restaurant owners traded his name like a secret, and slowly the circle widened. The boy, now a man, still lived modestly. His apartment was the same, his clothes simple, his meals cheap. But something had shifted. He carried himself differently, shoulders squared, eyes steady. When he walked into a room, people didn't see a kid from a children's home. They saw someone building something. Marcus noticed it too. "You feel it?" he asked one night, sitting on the hood of their battered van, city lights flickering in the distance. "Feel what?" "The buzz. People are starting to know who we are." The man shrugged, though inside his chest the words sparked like electricity. "They know who we are." For someone who'd once been hidden away like a shameful secret, the thought was intoxicating. But fame, even in small doses, has a long reach. One evening, as he finished unloading boxes into a client's storage room, his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him answer. "Hello?" The voice on the other end froze him. It was his mother. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He hadn't heard that voice in over a decade. It sounded the same, calm, careful. But to him, it carried every bruise of memory. "I heard about you," she said softly. "You've done well." The silence that followed was thick, almost unbearable. His mind flooded with images. The day she'd let go of his hand at the children's home. The way she'd turned her face away when he begged to stay. "What do you want?" he finally asked. His voice was steady, but inside, rage and sorrow battled for control. "We'd like to see you," she said. "Your father and I, we regret—" He hung up before she finished. His hand shook. He sat in the driver's seat of the van, staring at the wheel until Marcus climbed in. "What's wrong?" Marcus asked. "Nothing," he muttered, though the storm inside him said otherwise. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, torn between fury and longing. Part of him wanted to scream, "You don't get to come back now. You don't get to want me after throwing me away." Another part of him, the child who had once cried into thin blankets, ached for the impossible, for them to mean it. The next morning he made a decision. He would not let the past derail the future. His parents might know his name again, but they would not control his story. So he worked harder, took on bigger contracts, started hiring part-time help, paying other young black African men from the neighborhood to run deliveries. He invested in a second-hand van, less battered than the first. Slowly the business grew beyond survival, and with growth came recognition. A local newspaper ran a small feature. From orphan to entrepreneur, young black African man builds business against all odds. It wasn't front-page news, but it was enough. Strangers clipped the article, taped it in shop windows. He saw it once, posted outside the very corner store where he'd worked as a teenager, stocking shelves for minimum wage. He stopped in the doorway, staring at the words. For a moment, he felt the weight of years collapse into one truth. He had become visible. Marcus slapped him on the back. "Told you, man. The world's starting to see." He nodded, though inside he whispered the same words he always had. "Watch me." What he didn't realize yet was that the world wasn't the only one watching. His family, the ones who had erased him, had begun to circle back. Not out of love, out of interest. And soon the boy they abandoned would be standing in front of them again, not as a child begging for acceptance, but as a man they could no longer ignore. The article changed everything. It was only a few hundred words in a local paper, but sometimes small sparks light the biggest fires. Contracts multiplied, calls poured in. The name he had once whispered to himself in the dark, forgotten, erased, was now being spoken aloud by strangers with admiration. And that's when the ghost came knocking. It started with a letter, no return address, just his name scrawled across the envelope in a hand he recognized instantly. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside, the words were polite, almost rehearsed. "We are proud of you. We'd like to reconnect. Please call us." He crumpled the paper, then smoothed it out, then crumpled it again. For hours, it sat on his kitchen counter like a wound that refused to close. A week later, the phone rang again. This time it was his father's voice. Deep, clipped, cautious. Son, we've heard about your success. Your mother and I, would like to meet. Son. The word landed heavy, like a stone in his chest. He hadn't been their son for over a decade. He hung up without replying. But they didn't stop. Messages kept coming, calls, letters, even a visit to his office. He came back one evening to find them waiting outside, standing awkwardly near the door. His mother clutched her purse like it was armor. His father's hands were jammed into his pockets, jaw tight. For a moment, time folded. He was 8 years old again, begging them not to leave him at the children's home. The cold goodbye, the car pulling away, the tears, the silence. Now here they were, trying to undo years with a single meeting. Please, his mother said softly, we just want to talk. He stared at them, torn between rage and something worse, longing. A part of him still wanted what they were offering, family, belonging, connection. But another part knew the truth. They hadn't come back because they loved him. They'd come back because he had something they wanted. Marcus appeared in the doorway behind him, arms crossed. You want me to call security? He asked. No, the man said, his voice steady. I'll handle it. He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Why now? He asked. His voice was quiet but sharp. Why after all these years? His father cleared his throat. We made mistakes. We regret them. Mistakes? The word caught fire in his mouth. You abandoned me. You left me in a home like I was garbage. That's not a mistake. That's a choice. His mother's eyes filled with tears. We were scared. We didn't know how to handle. You didn't want to handle me, he cut in. You wanted me gone. Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Finally, his father said, we just want another chance. He laughed bitterly. A chance? To what? Share in what I built? Call me your son again now that it benefits you? They flinched, but didn't deny it, and that told him everything. He stepped back, the fire in his chest burning hotter than ever. You had your chance. You had years of chances, and you chose yourselves every single time. You don't get to choose me now. With that, he turned and walked inside, leaving them standing in the cold. His hands shook as he leaned against the wall, breathing hard. Marcus watched him carefully but said nothing. Some wounds didn't need commentary. That night, he sat at his desk, staring at the crumpled letter. He thought about shredding it, burning it, erasing it completely. But instead, he tucked it into the back of his notebook. The same notebook that once held his childhood vows. Not as a keepsake, as a reminder. The past had come knocking, and he had answered, not with begging, not with silence, but with strength. For the first time, he realized something. The boy they had abandoned was gone. He had buried that boy himself. What stood in his place was a man, and that man owed them nothing. It would have been easier if they had stopped after that night outside his office, if his parents had taken his refusal as the end of the story. But pride mixed with desperation doesn't vanish quietly. They didn't retreat, they escalated. A few weeks later, he received an invitation, hand-delivered by a neighbor, to a family dinner. Not just a dinner, though, a spectacle. His parents had organized a gathering at their home, inviting relatives, friends, even neighbors who hadn't spoken to them in years. The headline of the invitation might as well have read, "Look who came back into our lives." Marcus nearly tore the card in half when he saw it. They're using you. Don't go. But something in him hesitated. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about the story they were trying to tell. Their story. And he wasn't about to let them rewrite it. So he went. The night of the dinner, he pulled up in a car that wasn't new but wasn't falling apart either. His first true symbol of success. As he stepped out, all eyes turned. The neighbors, the cousins, the aunts and uncles who once whispered about the poor disabled boy now stared at a man in a sharp suit, his chin high, his presence commanding. Inside, the dining room glowed with warm light. A long table stretched across the room, piled high with food. His parents beamed like hosts of a grand reunion. His father's hand clapped his shoulder, a gesture rehearsed for the audience. His mother kissed his cheek as if years of silence hadn't passed. Everyone, his father announced loudly, our son has come home. Gasps, applause, murmurs of surprise. The guests leaned in, hungry for drama. Some smiled with genuine warmth, others with curiosity. His parents basked in the glow, pretending they had always been proud. He sat at the table, but the food tasted like ash. Conversation buzzed around him, stories twisted, history rewritten. His father told tales of his hard work, painting himself as the man who had instilled discipline. His mother described long years of sacrifice, as if her absence had been an act of love. Finally, he couldn't stand it anymore. He set his glass down with a quiet finality. The room hushed. Dozens of eyes turned toward him. "I think there's something you all should know," he began. His voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of years. "This isn't a reunion. This isn't a celebration of family. This is a performance." His parents stiffened. His father tried to interrupt, but he held up a hand. "You abandoned me," he said clearly, his gaze sweeping the room. "When I was 8 years old, you left me at a children's home. You never came back. You erased me from your lives, and now, because I've built something of my own, you want to claim me again. But you don't get to rewrite history." The room fell silent, thick with shock. A cousin gasped. An aunt covered her mouth. Neighbors exchanged stunned glances. His mother's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. His father's jaw clenched, eyes flashing with anger, but he said nothing. The man stood, pushing back his chair. "I'm not here to play a role in your story. I've written my own, and it doesn't include you." With that, he walked out, leaving the table frozen in silence. Outside, the night air hit him like a wave of relief. Marcus was waiting by the car, arms crossed, eyes proud. "You didn't just walk out," he said. "You burned the stage down." The man exhaled, his chest lighter than it had ever been. For years, he had carried the weight of their abandonment like a chain. Tonight, in front of everyone, he had shattered it. And as he slid into the car, he realized something powerful. The shame that had once defined him no longer belonged to him. It belonged to them. The dinner should have been a triumph for his parents, a showpiece of reconciliation. Instead, it turned into their undoing. Word spread fast, faster than they could contain. Neighbors whispered, relatives gossiped, and soon the whole community knew the truth. The Golden family portrait had cracks running through it, and he had been the one to expose them. For him, it was liberating. For them, it was humiliating. In the days that followed, his phone buzzed with messages, some from relatives he barely knew. "I had no idea you were so strong to share that." Others from people who had once dismissed him, now reaching out to offer praise or apologies. For the first time, the story wasn't his parents to control. It was his. Marcus, a black African man, grinned every time a new article appeared online, every time someone mentioned the confrontation. "You're a legend, man, Marcus," a black African man said to the young black African man. "You stood up in front of everyone and told the truth. People respect that." Respect. That was new. It tasted better than money. But his parents didn't fade quietly. Shame had made them desperate. They tried calling again, leaving voicemails that swung wildly between anger and pleading. "How could you humiliate us like that?" one day. "We just want to make things right," the next. He didn't answer. Then came the letter from a lawyer. They weren't suing, at least not yet, but they wanted a discussion about family inheritance. The irony stung. Years ago, his black African parents had thrown him away because they thought he'd be a burden. Now they were circling back, not to give, but to take. To Marcus, a black African man, nearly tore the letter in half. "They don't quit, do they?" "No," the man said quietly, "but neither do I." The young black African man threw himself back into work. His delivery business was growing, expanding beyond groceries and restaurants, into contracts with local offices, schools, even a hospital supply wing. He hired more drivers, invested in better vans, and built systems that ran smoother than ever. Every obstacle became fuel. Every insult from the past became motivation. But the fallout from the dinner wasn't just about his parents. It also shifted how the community saw him. People no longer pitied him as the boy who had been abandoned. They admired him as the man who had survived it. Invitations rolled in to speak at schools, to share his story with youth groups, to sit on panels about resilience and entrepreneurship. Standing at those podiums, the young black African man felt the power of his voice in a way he never had before. The kid who once whispered, "Watch me," into the dark was now speaking into microphones, his words echoing in rooms filled with faces that actually listened. Yet with every speech, every handshake, every nod of respect, the shadow of his parents lingered. He could feel them circling, plotting their next move. Because people who thrive on control don't surrender easily. And sure enough, they made one last desperate play. A month after the dinner, he arrived at a community event to find his parents already there, standing near the entrance, greeting guests like they owned the place. His chest tightened as whispers spread through the crowd. He had a choice: walk away and let them reclaim the spotlight, or confront them again. This time not in a dining room, but on a public stage. He took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and stepped forward. The boy they once erased was gone. The man who replaced him wasn't afraid of shadows. The community center was buzzing that night. Rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors, business owners, and students eager to hear from the man. He had spoken at places like this before, but this one felt bigger. Cameras were set up in the back. Reporters lined the sidewall with notepads ready. And then, like smoke sliding under a door, his parents appeared. They stood at the entrance, shaking hands, smiling with the polished charm of people who'd rehearsed for hours in the mirror. His mother clutched his arm as though she belonged at his side. His father introduced himself to strangers as if he'd been a guiding force in his son's success. The crowd didn't know the full history, only pieces. Whispers rippled through the room. "Those are his parents? I thought he grew up in a home." So what's the real story? His jaw tightened. For years, silence had been his curse. Silence at the dinner table, silence in the children's home, silence when he begged them not to leave. But not anymore. When it was his turn to speak, he walked to the podium, heart steady. The lights were hot, the room expectant. He looked out at the faces, curious, skeptical, supportive, and then his eyes fell on his parents, standing proudly at the back as if waiting for their cue. He didn't flinch. "I want to tell you a story," he began. "Not about success or money or even business. I want to tell you about abandonment." The room grew still. "When I was 8 years old, my parents left me at a children's home. They didn't come back. For years, I thought I was the problem. That if I had been stronger, faster, healthier, maybe they would have stayed. But the truth is, love doesn't abandon you. Fear does. Pride does. Shame does." A murmur moved through the audience. His parents shifted uncomfortably, their smiles fading. He continued, voice rising with conviction. "Everything I have built, I built without them. Every dollar earned, every contract signed, every step forward, I walked alone until I found people who believed in me. Real family isn't the one that leaves you behind. Real family is the one that shows up when it matters." Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then swelling into a wave. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. His parents tried to shrink into the corner, but the spotlight had already turned cold and merciless. He finished simply, "So tonight I stand here not as someone's son who finally made his parents proud. I stand here as a man who proved that being unwanted doesn't mean being unworthy." The ovation shook the room. People rose to their feet, and in that thunder of clapping hands, his parents slipped quietly out the back, their exit swallowed by the roar of the crowd. For him, it was more than a speech. It was the turning point, the moment when the power shifted for good. No longer was he the child begging for recognition, no longer the boy erased from family photos. He was a man standing in his own light, untouchable by the shadows of the past. Afterward, Marcus clapped him on the back, grinning ear to ear. "You didn't just tell your story," he said. "You took it back. They can't touch it now." And for the first time, he believed it. The boy who had once whispered, "Watch me," into the dark had finally been seen. Not as a victim, not as a burden, but as proof that resilience can rewrite destiny. Humiliation has a way of hardening people. After that speech, his parents could have vanished quietly, licking their wounds in private. But people who thrive on control rarely let go without a fight. 2 weeks later, they showed up again, this time not at his office, not at a dinner, but at his apartment. He opened the door to find them standing there, looking smaller than he remembered. His mother's eyes were red, as if she'd been crying for days. His father, usually so rigid, looked tired, his posture bent under some invisible weight. "Please," his mother whispered, clutching her purse with both hands, "just hear us out." He almost slammed the door, almost, but something in her voice, desperation or maybe guilt, made him pause. He let them in. The silence was suffocating. They sat on the couch, perched stiffly like guests in a stranger's house. He remained standing, arms crossed. His father spoke first. "We've lost everything," he said, his voice gravelly. "The business, the house, even our reputation. People talk about what you said. They look at us differently now." "And whose fault is that?" he shot back. His father flinched. His mother reached out a trembling hand. "We know we failed you. We made choices we can't undo. But you're still our son. We just want a second chance." The words twisted inside him. For years, he had dreamed of them saying exactly that. But now, hearing it, he felt nothing but anger. "You want a second chance?" His voice cracked with fury. "Where was my second chance when you left me at that home? Where was my second chance when I begged you not to go? You chose your pride over me, and now, because I've built something, you suddenly remember your parents?" Tears streamed down his mother's cheeks. His father stared at the floor. The silence stretched until it snapped. "I don't need you," he said quietly, each word deliberate. "I haven't needed you for a long time. The people who raised me, who believed in me, who stood by me, they weren't bound to me by blood. They chose me. That's what family is. A choice, and you chose to leave." His mother sobbed openly. His father's hands clenched into fists, but he said nothing. They rose slowly like people carrying weights too heavy to bear. At the door, his mother turned one last time. "We'll always be your parents," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, you'll always be the people who left me. That's not the same thing." The door closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the room. He stood there for a long time, heart pounding, chest hollow. A part of him had always wondered how this moment would feel, whether it would heal, whether it would break him. Instead, it clarified him. They were his past, not his future. When Marcus came by later and found him staring at the closed door, he asked, "You okay?" "Yeah," he said, voice steady. "For the first time, I think I really am." That night, he opened his notebook, the same one he'd carried since childhood, and wrote a single line at the top of a blank page. "Family isn't who leaves, family is who stays." It was the final severing of the chain that had bound him for so long. The boy who had once begged for love was gone. The man who had built himself from the ground up was ready to step fully into the life he had fought for. And his parents, for all their pleas, were left with the only thing they had truly earned: regret. The last confrontation left him hollow but lighter, like a wound finally drained. For years, he'd carried their absence like a scarlet letter, proof that he was unwanted. Now, with their final plea behind him, that burden shifted. It wasn't his to carry anymore. It was theirs. But letting go wasn't the same as moving forward. To move forward, he had to decide not just who he wasn't, but who he was. Opportunities were multiplying. The business wasn't just a scrappy delivery service anymore. It had grown into a logistics company with multiple vans. It had secured contracts with schools and offices, and employed people who depended on him for their paychecks. He wasn't hustling just to survive. He was leading. One morning, standing in his small but busy office, he watched his drivers load boxes into vans. They joked, traded stories, laughed loudly. For a moment, he just listened. These weren't employees. They were proof. Proof that he had created something bigger than himself. Later that week, he was invited to speak at a youth conference. Hundreds of kids filled the auditorium, many from foster homes, shelters, and broken families. He stood at the podium, looking out at their expectant faces. "I used to think being abandoned meant I was broken," he told them. "I thought it meant I'd never be enough. But I learned something. You're not defined by who leaves you behind. You're defined by what you do after. You're defined by who you become." The room erupted in applause. Some kids wiped tears. Others leaned forward, eyes wide with hope. And in that moment, he realized his story wasn't just his. It was theirs too. A roadmap, a lifeline. Afterward, a boy about 12 came up to him, small, thin, with wary eyes that looked too old for his age. "Do you really think someone like me can make it?" the boy asked. He knelt down, looked the kid straight in the eye, and said, "I don't just think it, I know it, because I was you once." The boy smiled faintly, the kind of smile that cracks open a dark room. That night, he wrote again in his notebook. Not a vow this time, but a mission. My story isn't just about proving them wrong. It's about helping others prove themselves right. Marcus noticed the change. You're different lately, he said. Different how? Before you were fueled by anger. Now you're fueled by purpose. That's bigger. That lasts longer. He nodded. Marcus was right. Anger had gotten him here, but purpose would take him further. Meanwhile, whispers of his parents' shame still floated through the community, but they no longer stung. They no longer mattered. Because the truth had been spoken, and the truth was stronger than any rumor. He was no longer the boy begging for love, or even the young man clawing for survival. He was something new. A leader, a builder, a man with a story he controlled. And as he stood on the balcony of his modest apartment, city lights sprawling below, he whispered the words that had carried him since childhood. Only this time they sounded different, stronger, certain. Watch me. Not to his parents, not to the world, but to himself. Years had passed since the night he walked out of that children's home with nothing but a duffel bag and a notebook full of vows. Back then, freedom had felt terrifying. Now, standing in the glass office of his own headquarters, rows of vans lined up outside, employees bustling with purpose. It felt like the most natural thing in the world. He had done it. He had built something real. Not just a business, but a life. The company wasn't just about deliveries anymore. It had expanded into full logistics, warehouses, partnerships, technology systems. That made supply chains smoother than his younger self could have imagined. He had investors calling, reporters writing, conferences inviting him to speak. He was no longer just a name whispered in the neighborhood. He was a figure of respect. But the real victory wasn't in the money or the attention. It was in the faces of the people who now depended on him. The young drivers he'd hired out of tough circumstances, the single mothers working in his offices, the interns he mentored from local schools. Every paycheck he signed was proof that the cycle of abandonment could be broken. One evening after a long day, Marcus joined him on the balcony overlooking the city. You ever think about how far we've come? Marcus asked, lighting a cigarette. From a busted van to this? He chuckled. Every day. And I still feel like we're just getting started. But even in that triumph, the ghosts of his parents lingered. He hadn't heard from them in months. Word in the community was that they had moved away, tired of the stares, the whispers, the shame. He didn't miss them. Not anymore. What he felt instead was something new. Release. They had tried to erase him, tried to return when it suited them, tried to claim what wasn't theirs. And in the end, all they carried was regret. He carried something different, legacy. Weeks later, he was invited to a gala honoring local entrepreneurs who had overcome adversity. He stepped onto the stage in a crisp black suit, the spotlight blinding, applause rising like thunder. For a moment, he thought back to that 8-year-old boy standing on the steps of the children's home, watching the taillights of his parents' car disappear. That boy had been small, scared, broken. Now he was the man they could never imagine, confident, powerful, whole. In his speech, he didn't mention revenge. He didn't mention shame. Instead, he spoke about resilience. I used to believe that being abandoned meant I was worthless, he told the audience. But worth isn't given, it's created. And when the world tells you that you don't belong, that's your chance to prove them wrong. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with success, with love, with the life you choose to build. The crowd rose to its feet. The ovation was thunderous. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled, people cheered his name. And in that roar, he felt the final piece click into place. This was the justice he had waited for. Not his parents begging, not their humiliation, but standing tall in the light, owning his story, and showing the world that what was once abandoned could become unstoppable. After the gala, as he stepped outside into the cool night air, Marcus nudged him with a grin. So what now, billionaire? He smiled, a quiet confidence in his eyes. Now we keep building, because this isn't the end. This is just the beginning. And as he walked toward the future, the words that had carried him since childhood echoed once more. Not bitter, not desperate, but triumphant. Watch me. The boy they abandoned was gone. The man they created by leaving him behind was here to stay.